Good morning. So today we are going to be talking about parenting with cancer. Again, this is an educational series. This is session B. There was a session A, and that is accessible as well. They don't necessarily have to be shown together, but it is an option if you'd like another kind of foundational piece to learn about this. As an introduction, again, my name is Sam North. I have my master's in international disaster psychology from the University of Denver, and I'm currently working on my PsyD in clinical psychology. I'm a health psychology intern at American Family Children's Hospital at the moment and doing an elective with the Carbone Cancer Center. I also am a part-time facilitator at Gilda's Club Madison. So I'm going to go through what the objectives of today are. Um, the objectives are going to start with exploring complex emotions and issues that surround end of life as a parent, learning how to talk to kids about death and dying and what language that can be helpful to use, talking about ways to engage in legacy activities as a family, and then learning about other resources and organizations that support children and family with grief. So this slide was shown previously on the other presentation as well. I think what's helpful about this is just setting the stage to be able to understand that this is something that affects lots of people. So noting that just over 1.9 million new cancer diagnoses were expected in 2023. Nearly 3 million children and adolescents have a parent in the US who has or has had cancer. And of newly diagnosed adults with cancer, about 1 in 5 have children under the age of 18 years old. So something that we hear is that um, this can feel like a difficult thing to be going through and can feel really isolating. And so we like to share that there are other people that are experiencing this as well. And sometimes that can be really helpful um, to be able to know that and to think about what it might be like to connect with others. Okay, so the next thing that we talk about is navigating stressors. Again, this was something that was part of session A, if you've seen that. But we know that for parents or caregivers facing end of life, there are even more stressors that fall on top of everyday stressors as a parent, of being an adult caregiver with cancer, and then when facing end of life. So we know there can be more legal ramifications and considerations. There can be kind of wrapping up or making decisions about ending work and what that will look like. This can bring up a whole host of additional emotions, things like death anxiety. So just like to share this, to know that there are a lot of stressors to navigate, and it's not a simple or a complex experience. Or sorry, it's not a simple, but it is a complex experience that we know that families go through. So just some time for some self-reflection. I think it can be helpful. A lot of times when people say, "Oh, how are you doing?" This automatic response that folks often have is, um, I am doing okay. It can be helpful to think through how else might we describe how we're feeling, or what is a more specific way to talk about what's coming up for us. So I just invite you, if you're participating, that you can think through what are emotions that you've experienced on here. Was there anything unexpected or new or surprising? All in the caveat that there is no wrong way to feel. But I think that this can be helpful because when we have um, caregivers or parents or anyone for that matter that is um, facing a non-curable diagnosis or is thinking about end of life, that a lot of times there's these additional um, feelings that might come up for them. Okay, so another thing that we like to touch on is this idea of the pressure to parent perfectly. So we have a lot of parents and caregivers share that there's this idea that, okay, I'm not going to be around necessarily much longer, and so I need to make sure that my parenting is perfect. And so something that we invite is thinking about what's perfect versus what's good enough. Thinking about catching yourself with should language. So I should never get mad or yell at my child. I should always be doing fun things with them. This can kind of be a trap that puts a lot of pressure onto an individual that thinks that they need to do these things perfectly. And we know that perfect isn't attainable, and that's also not what kids are looking for. Another thing that we like to touch on related to this is the role of social media and knowing that social media portrays really the highlight reels of people's life and often doesn't speak as much to the challenges. So it can create this comparison of unrealistic expectations. So keeping that in mind as well. There's also this idea that many parents or caregivers share that they feel pressure for everything to be perfect because it will be the last. So this will be our last vacation as a family, or our last holiday, a last birthday. Um, and similarly, this pressure to be remembered in a certain way. I want them to think about X, Y, or Z. Part of why we talk about this is we know that kids and children often don't have a one memory that they hang on to when they think about parents or caregivers, but they think about what were those people like as a whole? Did they make me feel safe? Did they care for me? Did they make me laugh? Whatever it is that those characteristics are that you want to share with your kids or have them remember, that's typically built up and isn't going to rely on one perfect last vacation. So we share this slide just with the hope that people will continue to have grace with themselves and understand that there is no need and truly no way to parent perfectly. Okay, the next thing we like to talk about is the idea of legacy, which is how can you be present in the future when you're not, and how can you create memories together when you are here. So, legacy and memory making can look like a lot of different things. This can look like crafts together, it can look like sharing recipes, sharing stories, creating traditions to carry on. Oftentimes, we hear about this misconception that parents or caregivers feel like they have to leave letters or videos for the future for their children to have. Um, which puts people in a hard position because it's asking you to fortune tell because you don't know what your child might need on their 16th birthday or on their wedding day or if they will get married and things like that. So we often invite people to think about if you feel this desire to make a video or to write a letter, can you talk about how you see your child? So, what were they like as a baby? What were they like growing up? What are fun memories you have of them? That can be a nice thing that they can reflect on. And oftentimes we hear from people that that comes easier because you're just thinking about your experience rather than having to find what are the perfect words to leave for these future situations that I actually don't know what they'll look like. And then we also listed on here these different wish fulfilling organizations. A lot of these are able to grant wishes for families to do things together and can be a good resource to consider if folks have interest. All of all of the links or all of the websites are linked here. And so in the actual slide deck would be able to connect them. You could also Google these and they should come up as well. Okay. The next topic we like to talk a little bit about is making treatment decisions. because there can be tension between different influences on treatment decisions. So people might say, okay, my medical provider is suggesting this, but I'm getting this message from my family. I feel this responsibility towards children. I also think about what do I value as quality of life. So this can be really complicated. Maybe there are several choices about stopping treatment versus continuing treatment to try to extend life. And for some families, they really want this person in their life to do that. And maybe for the individual going through that, they want to be done with treatment, and that can bring some tension. There's also this idea that we hear that comes up a lot about fight language. So, in the cancer community, people have really mixed feelings on this. For some people, they find that really motivational and can latch onto it. And for others, the fight language um, can be frustrating or defeating or make it seem like they're just not putting in enough effort when cancer is not based on one's effort. So just keeping in mind that there can be these difficulties around treatment decisions, and it can look quite complex. So going to move now a little bit into the second goal. So the second objective of this was to talk a little bit about what is it like to explain death to a child? What language can be used? How could this conversation look? Oftentimes people feel really hesitant to use terms death and dying, but it's actually really important to use clear and concrete language with kids, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. There is no perfect way to define this, but this is an example of how we might explain cancer. So, a person's body is made up of cells. Cancer is when the cells don't grow right and they make the body sick. Sometimes cancer causes a lump or bump to grow, and sometimes cancer can make the blood, bones, or other parts of the body so sick that the body stops working. So a lot of times when setting up this foundation of how to talk to kids about death and dying can be first helpful to think about their age and their developmental level. For younger kids, it's really helpful to start with the basics of what does it mean to be alive. So we might say, I can tell I'm alive because if I put my hand on my chest, I can feel my heart beating. Or I can take a deep breath. I can do a jumping jack or move my body. These are all different ways that I know I'm alive. We can talk about death is when something gets so old or sick or hurt that it stops working. So when someone dies, they can't jump up and down, their heart stops beating, they're no longer taking breaths. It also can be really helpful to frame this in the context of everything lives and dies. And so can be helpful to think about this as part of a circle of life and can show images of that to help understand for kids. So maybe showing a flower that's bloomed and a flower that's wilted and dying, or different plants or trees or animals. That can sometimes be a more gentle introduction to this concept. A few reminders. It's helpful to let children know that when someone dies, they're not sleeping and they can't come back, because that can be really confusing for kids. Um, it's also most of the time, especially with cancer, dying is not a choice. So letting kids know that this person in their life isn't choosing to die. And then sometimes it can be a little bit confusing for children because they know that mommy or daddy or grandma or grandpa or whoever it is was taking medicine, and instead of getting better, they still died. And so sometimes this will come up as a question for children, and that can be helpful to think about. Sometimes medicine can help, and sometimes medicine doesn't help, but just knowing that that can bring up some worries for kids as well. So explaining death, it can be helpful to follow kids' leads and take breaks when they need it. So if you're starting to have this conversation and kids are giving you signs that they're feeling overwhelmed, it's okay to take a break. Part of the reason also earlier that we mentioned that it's important to have this kind of concrete language is because children can engage in something that we call magical thinking. So magical thinking might look like, oh, mommy, mommy went to sleep and didn't wake up. And if we say that to a child, they might think, oh my gosh, why won't mommy wake up? I don't want to go to sleep tonight. What if I don't wake up? And so that can be really confusing language to them, similar to, um, oh, we lost dad. For some children, then it's, well, can we find them? Where did they go? Even talking about um, they went to heaven or other religious or faith beliefs, sometimes children might ask, well, can we visit them there? Or they might say, I want to die too, so I can go there, which for some people can feel a little bit upsetting. And knowing that for some children, depending on their age, they just don't understand the permanence of death. And what they're really trying to communicate most often in those moments is, I miss this person and I want to be with them. However, as always, it's important to kind of check in with what they mean about that. And if you have any safety concerns, to reach out to crisis services or a local emergency department. However, it's not uncommon for kids to make statements like that. And then lastly, we like to talk about it's absolutely okay. It's very much encouraged to integrate your family's belief systems into your explanation. Just know that you should be prepared to address questions they might have about your family, your cultures, beliefs for death, and possible afterlife, because sometimes kids really want to know more. So I won't go through these in depth because they're available on the slide and people can pause and read through and do what feels most helpful based on the ages of children. I'm just going to touch on a point or two from each of these different age groups. And this is thinking about how do children react to loss at different developmental stages. So for kids that are infants up to 2 years old, they don't understand the permanence of death. They expect that somebody's going to come back, and they can feel this more as a separation. Sometimes kids of this age might seem unaffected. They might push away from people or cling to people that they normally wouldn't have. Um, they can have more separation anxiety, so they can really be supported by avoiding confusing words and helping them understand that the person can't come back. For kids that are in this age of 3 to 5 years old, they have a limited and more of that concrete, like we talked about, understanding. They might believe that the person can still be hungry or breathe even though they've died. This is kind of that prime age for magical thinking. They might seem fine sometimes, other times have difficulty kind of soothing themselves. It can be helpful to use that honest language to explain it and can model and explain how you're feeling. So it's okay for this age group to say, I'm feeling really sad that dad died, and help them start to gain that language around what it's like to feel big emotions. Here's a little more information around that. At this age, you start to maybe see too some trouble sleeping. You might see some regression or them acting younger than normal. Regression could look like if they were potty trained, having accidents again, if they were sleeping alone, wanting to sleep with somebody again. So just knowing that that's something that might come up in this age. For 6 to 9 years old, they can start to understand that death is permanent. Um, Sometimes this age group will take on a little bit more of blame or guilt, thinking, is it something I did? Could I have caused it? Um, this age sometimes also can be a little bit scared about death and believe that it's something scary that comes to get you. Sometimes kids will be confused, have questions. Um, Distress might come out as anger, irritability. They might have more stomach aches or headaches. Um, They might want to seem like nothing is wrong to their friends. Um, Again, it can be helpful to express and model different ways of feeling and responding to feelings. And it can be helpful for this age group to have some physical outlets. So being able to play or do sports or run around and get some of that energy out can be helpful. For our 10 to 12-year-olds, they fully understand typically what dead means and that death is universal and irreversible. So meaning all things die and can't come back to life. Again, this is dependent on developmental understanding. So every child might be a little bit different, but generally at this age, that's the understanding. Lots of different feelings that might come up or reactions that this age might have. They might feel embarrassed or guilty. This age group starts to think more about like, oh, I shouldn't have been mean to mom or dad, or I wish I wouldn't have said that to them. This age also sometimes has more of a curiosity about death, and that's okay too. It can be helpful to give them space to talk if they're wanting to, giving them reassurance that they're safe. Um, they also might be more likely to talk to peers, so just knowing that that is a potential as well. And then for these teenagers, so 13 and older, they might be able to think a little bit more about spirituality or existential things. They might think a little bit more about the meaning of life and how this integrates into their beliefs around that. Um, they also might feel some guilt around things that they did or said with the person that died. They might be angry. They also can start to develop more of this fear or worry of being abandoned. So again, they can be helpful to talk with. For this age group, it can be helpful to have books for them to read or journals for them to kind of get their thoughts out. And then it's really important that this age group, that adult responsibilities don't get put onto them. We talk about this as being a balance that they can help out, but not wanting them to feel like they have to step in as the role of an adult. Similarly, this group might be more likely to talk to peers too, and so peer support groups can be really helpful for these ages. Okay, so something else that comes up is that people will ask about how do children get supported during the last few days of life, moments of life, through funerals and ceremonies, reactions afterwards. And this is a really complex topic. I want to preface it by there's no right or wrong answer, but we have some tips that sometimes can be a little bit helpful for folks in thinking about navigating these. So first of all, it can be helpful to find out what children already know. A lot of times this can be surprising for parents or caregivers that children will know more than anticipate because they're absorbing and paying attention to quite a bit that's going on around them. It can be a good time too to allow space for questions that they might have and answer to the best of your ability. It's okay to say, I don't know if you don't know the answer. For kids, it can be helpful to give them choices too. So when someone dies or is going to die, that can feel like it's taking away this sense of control in life. And so for kids, being able to make any choices about things can be helpful. This can be as small as, do you want this or this for dinner? And these can be up to bigger decisions, potentially based on your family's beliefs of, do you want to go to the funeral or don't you? So it's up to each family on what that looks like, but really trying to build in choice when possible can be helpful. It's also okay for kids to change their mind. So if they decide they want to do something or participate in some way, and then that moment comes and they don't want to, it's not uncommon and that's okay for that to happen. It can be helpful to prepare kids for what they might see physically or what changes to a person they might witness. So this is particularly helpful if there'll be things like an open casket, where they might see this person that they loved, this caregiver, in a way that they look really different or don't look like themselves. For younger kids, it can be really helpful to use play, to use books, to use dolls, for them to kind of express and process in that way, because younger kids might not have the words to talk about what's going on for them. Generally, we talk about it's best to not fully shield kids from the death and dying process fully, because it can be a way for them to process what they're going through. And if people don't allow them to be a part of it in any way, it can kind of send this message that you wouldn't be able to cope with this, you can't handle it, this is too much for you. So again, it's kind of up to each family's decision, but it can be helpful to allow kids to be part of meals or ceremonies or other activities or traditions, so that they can connect to others too around this person that they cared about. Also, for funerals or celebrations of life, ceremonies, things like that, attending those can help make death feel more concrete for younger children. Um, but it can be helpful to try to prepare them for what a funeral looks like, what happens during a funeral. For some people, they might go to um, go to a church or another place of worship, or the place where the funeral might be held ahead of time to show the children, let them walk around, let them see what it looks like. For some, that's not an option, but for others, it feels like it can be a good step in preparing them. Another thing is it can be helpful to ask about their worries and address any misconceptions. Like many things, a lot of times kids hear things at school, on TV, in all different places. And so sometimes information is correct and sometimes it's not as accurate. So it can be helpful to give space to kind of talk through anything that they might be worried about. Another thing that comes up a lot for families is that sometimes kids will not want to go to a funeral or a celebration of life or a ceremony. And that can be hard to hear and feel like, oh, are they missing out on something? And so we would say that generally it's okay if children make that decision not to go. A lot of times in those situations, we can emphasize the importance of that person's life rather than their death. And so knowing that a child likely spent time with that person when they were alive, and that it doesn't take away how much they cared about them if they're not there in this way. Um, Another thing that happens sometimes is these are big decisions that are typically involving a lot of emotions. And so know that sometimes other adults may disapprove, but you can make what decisions are best for your family because you know your children best. And just being prepared that if other adults react differently, it could be their own grief showing up, or it could be them having a hard time tolerating seeing a child upset. It's okay for kids to not know how they feel. And then the other thing that comes up sometimes is we want to be mindful of conflicting messages that kids might get. So they might have one person say, oh, you need to be brave. Dad would not want you to cry right now. And by another person, they might be told, it's okay to cry. It shows that we loved daddy. And for a child already going through so much, that can be really confusing. So just think about, is there a message that you want to give to your children, or be mindful of maybe what messages other people are sharing, and leave space to talk about that, as it could be helpful. Okay. Next thing we like to talk about is children's resiliency, because we know that kids can be resilient and they can face adversity. And so I included this quote that several studies have found that the quality of parenting that children receive after a death is one of the most powerful predictors of resilience in bereaved children or children that are grieving. But we also know that parents with cancer can talk to kids early in their end of life experience and can be actively involved in supporting their child. So this kind of talks about this can be beneficial before someone has died for the parent living with cancer, and also can be helpful for parenting partners or other caregivers that might be taking care of these children after the death. So um, a few general things we like to keep in mind with this is that grief tends to ebb and flow over time. It lessens in intensity as time goes on. And so know that there's not one moment where you'll see a child feeling resilient or a child grieving, but that these are really intertwined. But these are the building blocks of what we consider resilient parenting. So the first one is parent or caregiver self-care. This comes back to kind of the oxygen mask metaphor that you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. This is actually shown to be one of the most foundational parts of helping children build resiliency. The second one is strengthening positive bonds with children. So this can be quality time as a family, one-on-one time with each child, but consistently kind of showing up and being there to build up these bonds. The third one is listening to and encouraging children to share more. So this can be, tell me more about what's going on for you. This can be reflecting back what they're sharing, like, I'm hearing that you are really frustrated or really upset about this, and giving more space for those conversations to happen. The fourth one is creating effective family rules. So knowing that consequences and rules and boundaries are actually really helpful for kids and can help them have a sense of safety. And so deciding what is a consequence that's fair, that's consistent, that's enforceable, and how can I keep that going can be helpful so kids know what to expect. And then the last one is supporting children's coping. So this can look a lot of different ways because everyone grieves or might want support in different ways. But this can also be helpful to think about times that are coming up that might have more grief associated with it. So a person's birthday, a death anniversary, daddy-daughter dances are things where a caregiver or parent might have been involved. And sometimes this can be helpful to talk about how something's coming up and kind of share with each other what it might look like to support what they're needing. There's a few resources on here too. Kai's Journey is a series that talks about resilience. There's a Brief Parenting Network and then the National Alliance for Grieving Children. And these all have really great resources on what it is like to support a grieving child or to parent while grieving. So the resources I wanted to talk about, these are different books or things that can be helpful. There's child caregiver activity books. For all ages, there's local grief counseling in this area. That's a Grace Grief Support Center. And then for all ages too, there's an organization called Bright Spot Network, and they have a series of books for families facing cancer that can be helpful. For specific ages, they talk about grief and loss and death in really developmentally appropriate ways. So for kids age 0 to 3, the Goodbye book and The Way I Feel can be helpful. For kids age 4 to 10, here's a series of books that can be helpful as well, knowing that some, like Not the End of the Chavez Family, is in English and in Spanish, so some options available there. For 11 to 14-year-olds, they have books that kind of hit that teenage group a little bit more, and they have things that are more like stories, but also kind of practical ideas and tips for kind of working through grief. And then for 15 to 18-year-olds, these are just some other guides for people that are teens and going through grief and loss. So we know that talking about it can be helpful, and also using books and other resources can be really supportive as well. Right, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to the contact information that's on file. Otherwise, just want to say thank you so much for being here and hope that this was some helpful information.